Oh, how the press gallery thought that they would have their moment. They'd been bitching and moaning and trying to say that this country had had a major Greens revolution over summer, that everyone demanded extreme climate action, that it was time to adopt every idea that was rejected at the last election. Their pent-up frustration and bitchiness for not knowing the result of the Quiet Australian, well, it was on full show over summer. And with a few things hanging in the air, the expectations were that the Prime Minister was going to be under pressure, whatever that means, when he turned up to press gallery people today to answer their questions. And of course there was an awful lot of Bridget McKenzie, and wait till you see some of the questions The Guardian was asking about that and the way they were asking. But there were two very big things that were the real news that came out of the speech that the Prime Minister delivered today. The first was, for all those who thought that something was wrong over summer because the Prime Minister has this big red button on his desk that means when a disaster hits a certain level, you go whack, and then suddenly the army comes running in. Well, the truth is that system doesn't exist. In fact, the Defence Forces don't get called in until the state authorities call them in. And the ego that is always there, and we know it between local and state government, let alone state and federal government, means that they never want to admit that they need help. So the Prime Minister today talked about the idea of creating that red button, creating a scenario where, when a disaster becomes significant enough and is of a national focus, that they can hit the big red button and you get the troops whether you want them or not, whether you are asking for them or not. That was the first big bit of news. The second big bit of news is that the Prime Minister is not moving when it comes to the Greens agenda. He is going to do exactly what was endorsed by the country at the last election. We're part of the Paris Agreement, we're doing our bit when it comes to climate change, but there is a bigger point to be made, a human point, which is this. Human beings, unlike platypuses or any other animal that you can immediately think of that's probably a better metaphor than a platypus, we are able to adapt to our environments and sometimes to be able to even change our environments to make sure that we can live comfortably, that we continue to grow and better ourselves as a society. For example, when it's too hot to live in places like Cooper Pedy, you dig underground and live underground in Cooper Pedy. It means that if it is going to rain only every now and then, according to the climate alarmists, you need to capture the water. The water, like that is falling right now in North Queensland, where they've got about a year's worth of rain in some parts of Queensland in the past 24 hours. That you have to build dams, because if that's where the rain's going to fall and people are going to live everywhere else, just like as they do in Israel and lots of other places, you make the environment bend to you. You don't do it by destroying the environment, but you do the best to make the most of where there's an excess somewhere else, and you're able to move that excess and spread it out across the rest of the country. But there were a couple of very key moments from the speech that you probably didn't get to see because they were all focused on the sports matters or, of course, the coronavirus. But for those of you who have any concern about where the Prime Minister is on climate change, if you're somebody who is looking for the Goldilocks approach here, where it's not too hot and it's not too cold, it's just right, this is the Prime Minister who won last year's election, and this is the Prime Minister who actually represents the majority of Australians. Roll the tape.
So our climate action agenda is a practical one. It goes beyond targets and summits, and it's driven by technology, not taxation. This is important as there are real weaknesses in the current global action frameworks on emissions reduction. Current frameworks and agreements globally actually endorse massive increases in emissions from some of the world's largest and growing economies.
All right, the PM's got his swing back, and you can tell that he hit exactly the right note because Channel 2 went nuts and The Guardian thinks it's appalling. He's got plenty more where that came from.
He said, for people living in bushfire zones, hazard reduction is even more important than emissions reduction. So, David Spears, the Prime Minister seems pretty intent on really treating the symptoms here, not the cause being the warming globe.
Love you, Spearsy. Now, the other one worth showing you here is, again, how the Prime Minister talks about how this is the country that came up with a solution to hearing loss, the bionic ear. This is the country that today had scientists in Melbourne who were the first in the world to replicate the coronavirus in a lab here in Australia to be able to work out how to deal with it. That's exactly what happens when it comes to hotter temperatures, less rain, all of the things that the catastrophists say is on our way. Because at the end of the day, when Australia has 1.3% of the emissions for the global problem, we can't solve the problem. We can't solve the consequences of the problem when China can continue to pollute as much as it wants all the way till 2030. So just in case you missed him the first time, here's the Prime Minister hitting it out of the park.
The answer is not more taxes and increased global bureaucracy, but practical change driven by science and technology that allows companies and economies to develop and commercialise new technologies that are accessible, affordable and scalable the world over.
And that's the truth. Right now, we showed you last night on the show, there is technology that exists in Australia to deal with the consequences of climate change. That is not climate change denialism. That's dealing with climate change. We told you last night about those portable desal plants that are being moved to the western parts of New South Wales, where they're able to turn salt water into drinking water. These are in places where people have so little water that they have to ration their showers and have to think twice about washing their clothes. Australia has the brain power to be able to live in the 21st century while getting ready for the next century and the next century after that. Those who think it's all about climate change, well, they can have their way, but that's the green way. And I should point you to the latest news poll, the one that was oh so bad for the Prime Minister when it came to his personal standing. The Greens' vote, after this revolution on climate change, went up by 1 point. So good luck, Bubble. Keep screaming amongst yourselves. And any time The Guardian is outraged, the Prime Minister is exactly where he should be.